Welcome to Dutch Customs TV and welcome to my car. On this episode I'm going to get it dyno tested. This is my car. It's an Audi B5.5 S4 Avant, and for those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically a family size saloon, estate even, which is what the Avant means, with a 2.7 bi-turbo V6. Now out of the factory this thing ran about 265 horsepower, which back in 1997 when the S4 B5 first came out was actually quite a lot. This was before people started throwing 500 horsepower into anything with four wheels. Its transmission is a Torsen Quattro system, and I worked for Audi back in 2001 and I always wanted one of these things. I liked Audi's style back then. I liked the way they ignored the norm and just went, you know what, let's just put something big in a car. I mean, if you look a few years earlier than the B5 S4, you had the RS2, which was based on the 80 Avant, and they had something like 380 horsepower, and it was a straight 5 turbo manufactured with the help of Porsche. And they basically made an estate car that would absolutely dick a 911 round corners, but it would also not really be too far behind it in a straight line either. So that was the ethos of Audi back then, and I think to some extent it still is today, but everybody's doing it. So anyway, my B5.5, because it's a facelift model, S4 Avant. Now I bought this thing basically with two things in mind, or three or four things in mind. The first thing I wanted was, I knew I wanted an Audi Avant because I wanted a fast car which was big enough for my dog, and he goes in the back and he absolutely loves it. The other thing I wanted was one which had been tweaked a little bit to start with, something which could really keep me interested straight out the box. And but I didn't want it completely buoyed up, you know, I wanted it done properly. But also I didn't want to buy a done car, because my goal, my personal idea is that I want a car which has got 500 wheel horsepower, and these engines are very, very capable of making 500 wheel horsepower. When I say they're very, very capable, you've got to throw money and you've got to throw time into it, but that's the other reason I bought it, was because I was just starting Dutch Customs at the time and I wanted to be able to work on my own car. So the guy I bought it off was very honest about it, gave me an absolute ton of receipts and things. He said the last time that it had been dynoed, he was told when he bought it, now he hadn't had it long, but when he bought it he was told it had 387 horsepower. I've got an older dyno sheet for it which shows 330, which was when it had a stage 1 map done to it, which is literally when you plug it onto a computer and tell the ECU to go, it wants to go faster, and it does, because the cars come down tuned for economy and emissions and things like that. So it already had guaranteed about 330 horsepower, but supposedly it had been mapped again, but unfortunately didn't have the dyno sheet for it. Now, after driving it for not very long, I realised that it's not running quite as it should, and he said to me when I went to pick it up, he said it feels fast, but it doesn't feel as fast as it should if it's got 387 horsepower. You know, you're talking almost 400 pub horsepower for sure. And he was right, it does feel fast, but it doesn't feel really, really fast. The other thing it's definitely doing is overfueling a lot. When you kick down the throttle, there's a lot of black smoke comes out the back. It's also doing about 12 miles to the gallon, which doesn't help that as much. So it's obviously overfueling, and if it's overfueling, it means that the map that it's got on at the moment isn't working out with the equipment it's got on at the moment. So what's it got that we know of? It's definitely got a Tanoga flywheel, which is a lightweight single mass flywheel. It's definitely got a 5-puck racing clutch, because that's the one that the guy I bought it off put in it. It's definitely been lowered. It's on FKAK suspension, which I'm not actually mad keen on, because I tracked it soon after I bought it, and although it's good scene suspension, I don't think it's massively expensive, but it rollovers, it lowers the car nicely, but it's still pretty soft and it doesn't come with any adjustment on it. So when I tracked it, the thing was all over the place. It was cocking the wheel and what have you. What else do we know? It's got Porsche 993 twin turbo brakes on the front. It's got Brembo discs, which I fitted, which are S4 discs. So it's had bits and bobs done to it. It's got a handmade stainless steel exhaust system, which was on it when I got it, and it's nice and throaty. I don't know whether you can hear it. But the one thing we don't know is how much power it is actually making. I don't think it's 387, and I don't mind that, because I win either way. Like, if I dyno it and it's running much less than what we thought, it means, wow, this thing's pretty fast, and it is pretty fast as it is. There's not much which keeps up with it, and definitely not much that overtakes it. So it is pretty fast, but it's not out and out fast. But if it's pretty fast, and it turns out it's got one of my guesses, which you'll see later on my Facebook page, one of my guesses was 270, and I was like, come on, that was 5 horsepower more than it had originally. But if it is 270, I'll be happy, because I think, well, if it's got the potential for at least 330, which we know, proven on a dyno, and if it's got the potential for 387, which is hearsay from a dyno, and then if it's supposedly it's been fitted with RS4 injectors since then, which will make it potentially have even more than the 387, then that means that I'm going to go from a car which feels fast and is quite fast to a car which is really fast, which is going to be fun. And if it comes up at bang on 387, then I'll also be happy, because it means it's got exactly what I paid for it with. So that's pretty cool. Absolute favourite things about this car is the noise it makes. It sounds mental, and just so happens there's a little bridge coming up here. Have a listen to this, see if you can hear it. It just makes you want to be completely antisocial all the time. Now, the dyno test is tomorrow, and there's just a couple of very simple checks that we need to do in order to make sure it's ready for the dyno test. The main 3 things that need testing before it goes on the dyno: the oil, the coolant and the tyres. Everything else, you know, we check the brake fluid, things like that, but the main thing is that it's going to get hot, and it's going to be driven hard, and it's going to be on dynos, which is effectively the same as being on the road, so the tyres need to be up to pressure as well. So we'll do some very simple checks first. That's the brake fluid reservoir, and you can see that the brake fluid is sitting pretty much exactly on max. So not as important as the other things to check, but still worth looking at whilst we're under here. Now, I'm guilty, as I'm sure a lot of people are, of not doing these checks anywhere near as often as I should. So it's always good to have an excuse to have a poke around. Next thing we're going to check is the coolant. And as you can see, that's actually used a bit of coolant, and it's down onto the minimum out of the minimum max, so that's going to need a top up. And in order to check the oil, we're going to need a rag. So we pull the dipstick out, we wipe it off, and the reason you've done that is because if you've driven the car, the oil goes all the way up anyway, and you want an accurate level of what's actually sitting in the bottom. The engine should be warm, not hot, but warm, because the oil expands and gets thinner as it gets warmer, and so it should be warm. And if you can see the wet line on that, it's just under the maximum attach. It's pretty much there, to be honest. This little serrated line there is where it is with the minimum max, and that looks pretty good. And I'll stick just a little bit in. It's normally about a litre between minimum max, and it probably needs about a quarter of a litre. So we do the oil first. The oil cap on this is a nice Porsche one, just down to the side there. Put your funnel in. And I'm using Miller Motorsport 5W40 oil here, which is expensive but really nice stuff. And we've got what, 4 litres in here, so we want to go down to just above the 3.5 mark. The funnel's important because it always slops around all over the place, and you don't want to pour oil down the side of your engine. Just not a cool look. What do we reckon? Doesn't move, hasn't moved at all really, is it? So we'll let it settle out for a second or two, and then we will check it again. Where will I put the cap for that? So obviously that's got to wake its way down through the block to the bottom of the sump, and I will go and get some water. And as if by magic, now this isn't screen wash, it had screen wash in it, but it's been washed out since then. It's just a convenient big bottle. Now if we were going to do a full coolant change or whatever, we would make sure that it's got all the right amount of coolant for the water and what have you, but it's literally just a top up, so I'm just going to use plain water. Still a little bit warm. Just going to splash that in. I'm not as fussed about this going down the side of the engine because it's just water until it is the max mark. It's a bit annoying that the max mark is on that seam, so you can't really see it very well. So I'm going to go slightly on the safe side and just make sure that it... Now you can see the pink there, which is about level with it, so that should be that. Now we just have to check the tyre pressures. So to check my tyre pressures I'm going to need 3 things. A flathead screwdriver, this little widget, and a gauge. You wouldn't normally need the flathead screwdriver or this little widget, but I've got these rather fancy flush fit tyre valves, which you have to unscrew and then screw that thing into. So you pop off the cap, you put in the widget, just hand tight, and I've left a little torchy bit on my gauge so the batteries are flat. Be right back. So I'm back, I've changed the batteries. I've obviously left that little torchy thing on. Anyway, let's give it a go. Make sure it's zeroed. And we have 32.5 psi, which is pretty good. You can't really use the manufacturer's specs of the car for the tyre pressure because it's a different wheel completely, but I try to run an absolute minimum of 31 psi, a little bit harder if I can, just because it wears the tyres down a little bit less, saves on the fuel economy. I might run them a little bit softer to track it, but as I hope you'll see in a future episode at some point, I want to get some track wheels for this, which will have track tyres and track pressures, and it will all be great fun. So that's one done. I'm going to check the rest. Now the oil's had a couple of minutes to settle down to the bottom, so let's see what we've got. I always wipe it again. It's not really that necessary because you've already wiped it, so it should just come up to whatever level. And that is pretty much bang on maximum. So, job done. Oil's topped up, water's topped up, tyre pressures have been checked, and we're good to go for tomorrow. Now, you may remember I mentioned before a little Facebook sweepstake I put up to some of my friends, or all of my friends really, anybody who could see it on Facebook, who wants to take a guess at what the car's going to dyno at. So remember, the figure is 387, and it was sold to me with 387, not confirmed on a dyno, but that was the last thing that the guy I bought it off had been told by the previous guy. So it was unsubstantiated, but supposedly that's what it had. But he also, as you remember, said to me, I don't think it's running quite right. It does feel quick, but not as quick as it should do for 387 horsepower. So here's the guesses. Got Charlotte all the way up there at 345, which is nice. That would be a good figure to have. Possibly slightly optimistic. Now Adam, who I bought it off, is going with 340. Mike G, 337.3. We actually had a little race against his Astra VXR, which is also quite well tuned up, and they were exactly the same. He wasn't leaving me and I wasn't gaining on him, obviously all taking place on private roads, and he is coming in at 337.3. Robin 335, Cudden at 333, Jack, who's going with me tomorrow, at 330, Dylan at 329, I reckon 323, that's my little guess, Dave at 318, Bert reckons 315, he's got an annoying habit of being right about a lot of stuff, so let's see, Johnny P at 310, Chris at 309, Aidan at 295, and he actually revised that from 279, which is like, yeah, cheers mate, and John G at 5 horsepower. So let's hope it's pushing out a little bit more than that. The dyno test is being carried out at Circuit Motors in Castle Combe, just next to the racing circuit. It's actually extremely convenient for me because it's only 20 minutes down the road. So, on with the test! So the results are in. Now you will have noticed on the video that we did 3 pulls in total on the dyno. The first of which was just a warm-up run, so we didn't get a printout for it. But Jack and I did see on the screen a figure of 314.7 horsepower on the screen at that time, which would have meant that Bert was the closest, in fact only 0.3 of a horsepower out, and I did say he had an annoying habit of being right. However, you actually only did 2 recorded runs, which were the next 2. The first one was a high load run, which meant the rollers put a lot of stress, a lot of load on the car. And this one came in at 307 horsepower at 322 newton meters of torque, which means that Chris won that one. And the second run, which was a slightly lower one, and you may be able to see from there, has a much smoother curve, 309.7 horsepower at 320.9 foot-pound of torque. So nowhere near the 387 horsepower that had been bandied around in the past. However, as I said before, that's good news for me. I know for a fact, because I've got a printout, that it's capable of 330 horsepower plus. Also, I don't think that anybody's going to have removed upgrading equipment, so the chances are that this thing can go a lot more with not a lot of money, which is nice because it's not slow to start with. So there we go. I hope you enjoyed the episode. That's actually the end of the episode for now, but if, like me, you find the science almost as fascinating as the cars, stick around for the science bit at the end. It is a bit more of me rambling, so if you can't bring yourself to watch that, then that's it. I'll see you next episode. Thank you for watching. Now, as today's episode is about getting a car dynoed, and a dyno, I'm getting it dynoed to find out how much horsepower it's got at the flywheel, it made sense that today's science bit was about horsepower, or the relationship between torque and horsepower. Because this is a question which always comes up and people can't quite get their head round. What's horsepower, what's torque, and what's the difference between them, and why does your car have both, and which one's more important? And of course, the horsepower is the one you talk about down the pub. Like, oh, how much horsepower has your car got? And then, so what is horsepower, what's torque, and is torque just for tractors and trucks and stuff, and what? So anyway, I'm going to try and explain it with the aid of my science bit notepad. So torque itself is a twisting force. And I've got this nice strap here, and a twisting force is literally what I say. So if I'm holding this end still and I'm twisting this end, that strap now has torque in it, and it's not much torque because it's not I'm not twisting it very strongly, but if I was to let go, the strap will turn back to normal, and the force that that strap is exerting against me is the same as I'm exerting against it, which is why we're not moving, and that is the amount of torque. So that's what torque is. It's a twisting force. Now you can see why that's useful for tractors, trucks, things like that, as we said, because that twisting force is what turns the wheels, it's what drives them up hills, it's what pulls heavy loads. But of course, when you buy a truck or a tractor and stuff, you don't go, oh, how much horsepower is it? I mean, sometimes you do, probably, but the point is that your horsepower is normally talked about in speed applications. How much horsepower you got? Yeah, I've got 500 brake horsepower, 1000 brake horsepower in it. And so they're not really concerned about the torque. But horsepower is a measurement of how much torque you can apply over a given period of time. And it's kind of hard to explain what that means, but when I twisted my strap up, we're not moving, but your road wheels are moving. So you've got to keep applying that torque to keep it twisted to the same amount. Now, horsepower and torque are directly related, and the equation is bhp, which we use brake horsepower, equals torque times RPM over 5252, and there's some decimal points and stuff if you really want to get pedantic. So you can see your RPM and your torque are directly in that equation for what horsepower is. So they're not completely unrelated. Your horsepower is a product of your torque, but it's also a product of your RPM. And for this reason, if you ever, you'll see on my map tomorrow, and if you ever do get a car mapped, you'll also, for the people in who are maths wise who have spotted in this formula, if your RPM, so you got VHP equals, let's call it T, times, if your RPM was 5252, and the maths heads will notice that you can cancel that out like that, and then all you're left with is that. So at 5,252 RPM, your torque and your horsepower will always be the same. So a torque curve is going to look something like this. You'll start off with a bit of torque, then as your revs build up, it'll go up like this. Then you'll get peak torque, which is the RPM at which you get the absolute most torque. This, by the way, is RPM, and this is torque, but it's also horsepower, which is why sometimes you have like that. Now your torque is then going to start dropping off, because down here you're adding RPM, you're getting more torque, but it comes to the point where you can add more and more RPM, but you know what it feels like when you're on motorway or something, and when you're in the lower gears, before you get on the motorway, you boot it and you get a good kick of power, and then at the high RPM you stop getting as much for your throttle, which is why you change up a gear. So your horsepower is going to start off by going up, because as this figure goes up, this figure's also going up, so it's going to start going up quite sharply like this. Now at the figure where this starts coming down, this one is still going up, this is now coming down, but because that one's going up by quite a bit, you're still going to get more horsepower, but it's going to stop going up as sharply. And then there will be 5252. That's going to be the point where it crosses. Now, not all your torque and your horsepower curves are going to look like that, but that is why when you want to make a fast car, you're not actually adding horsepower. You're either adding torque, or you're adding RPM, or you're adding more torque at a higher RPM. So if you move this to here, you can see that that would carry on going up for longer. So when you fit turbos and things like that, people are like, oh yeah, how much horsepower is that going to give me? What you really want to be asking, if you're looking at the same rev limit, is how much torque is it going to give me, and whereabouts on my rev range is my torque going to be? Because as you can see, the higher you get your torque on the RPM range, the higher your horsepower is going to be. This is why Hondas, they're not particularly torquey. Everybody jokes about Hondas having low torque, but what they can do is rev out. This is also why bike engines have got so much horsepower for such a small engine, is because they're not very torquey at all. If you tried to fit a bike engine to a car, it would stall it because it can't physically pull the weight. Despite having 145 odd horsepower, which is what a lot of cars have, it's got no torque, but they rev out to what, 16,000 RPM, something like that. So if you want more horsepower, you add torque, you add RPM, and you add torque at higher RPM. And that is the difference between horsepower and torque, and that is why both are important, but in fact in some ways torque is more important when you're looking for big power. Enjoy.